"Ma'am, are you sure you're in the right place?" The question drifted across the polished marble lobby just loudly enough for every nearby customer to hear, and within seconds the soft hum of printers, keyboards, and polite conversation seemed to dissolve into an uneasy silence. Danielle Brooks stopped a few feet inside the front entrance of Franklin National Bank, the worn leather handbag resting against her side as morning sunlight spilled through the towering glass windows behind her, tracing a warm outline around her quiet figure. She was 46 years old, dressed in a neatly pressed navy cardigan, practical black shoes that had clearly walked more miles than they deserved, and a simple silver necklace that disappeared beneath the collar of her blouse. Nothing about her appearance demanded attention. Nothing suggested wealth. Nothing announced importance. That was exactly why Richard Coleman barely looked at her before making up his mind. Standing behind the customer service counter in his tailored charcoal suit, the branch manager flashed the kind of practiced smile reserved for people he believed would never challenge him. His polished shoes reflected the spotless marble floor, and his gold name badge gleamed beneath the bright ceiling lights. Years of managing one of Charlotte's busiest financial branches had convinced him that he could measure a person's worth within 5 seconds of seeing them walk through the door. Expensive watch. Confident posture. Designer briefcase. Luxury handbag. Those were the signs that mattered to him. Danielle carried none of them. She approached the reception desk with calm, measured steps, carefully setting her weathered handbag on the smooth granite counter as though it contained something precious. Before she could speak, Richard's eyes drifted toward the faded stitching, the scuffed leather corners, and the old brass zipper that had long since lost its shine. One eyebrow lifted almost automatically. "Can I help you?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already believed the answer would waste his time. Danielle offered a gentle smile. "Yes, I'd like to make a withdrawal, please." Richard glanced briefly toward the bag before looking back at her face. "Do you have an appointment?" Danielle shook her head. "No, sir." His smile became thinner. "Large withdrawals usually require planning." "I understand." Her voice remained soft. "I still need to make one today." Several customers waiting nearby began paying attention. A young couple filling out mortgage paperwork paused mid-sentence. An elderly man folded his newspaper without realizing it. Even one of the tellers quietly slowed her typing as she sensed the atmosphere beginning to shift. Richard leaned slightly across the counter. "How much are we talking about?" Danielle met his eyes without hesitation. "Everything." The single word lingered between them. Richard almost laughed. Almost. Instead, he let out a quiet breath through his nose and folded his arms. "Everything," he repeated. "Yes." He looked once more at the aging handbag resting on the counter, then back at the woman standing patiently before him. Something about the contrast amused him. His lips curled into a dismissive grin. "Ma'am," he said loud enough for several people to hear, "people don't usually carry their life savings in a bag that looks like it came from a yard sale." A few uncomfortable chuckles escaped from somewhere behind the line. Danielle didn't react. She neither defended herself nor lowered her eyes. She simply rested one hand on the old leather bag and quietly replied, "Please count everything before deciding what it's worth." Richard's smile widened with quiet confidence as he reached toward the worn brass zipper, completely certain that whatever waited inside could only confirm the judgment he had already made. Richard Coleman paused with his fingers resting on the worn brass zipper, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough for curiosity to spread through the lobby. He had learned years ago that confidence could be performed as much as it could be earned, and nothing entertained him more than proving himself right in front of an audience. Danielle Brooks simply stood there, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing steady, as though the whispers gathering around her belonged to another room entirely. She had spent most of her life becoming invisible to people who believed appearances told the whole story. Growing up on the east side of Charlotte, she learned early that patience often spoke louder than arguments. Her father had repaired school buses for nearly 30 years before arthritis forced him into retirement. Her mother had worked nights as a nursing assistant until illness slowly stole the strength from her hands. Danielle never complained about the sacrifices that followed. Instead, she worked wherever honest work could be found. Some mornings she stocked grocery shelves before sunrise. Afternoons were spent managing inventory for a neighborhood food pantry. On weekends she organized donation drives at her church without ever asking for recognition. Every paycheck had a purpose before it reached her account. Medical appointments. Prescription refills. Utility bills. Repairs on the small brick house her parents had purchased decades earlier. Friends often wondered why she never seemed interested in vacations, designer clothes, or expensive dinners. Danielle always answered with the same gentle smile. Some investments cannot be measured by receipts. The old handbag resting on the counter had traveled beside her through almost every chapter of that journey. Its faded leather had survived crowded buses, rainy sidewalks, hospital waiting rooms, church gatherings, and countless early mornings when she carried lunch packed in reusable containers because wasting money never felt responsible. The stitching had loosened twice before she carefully repaired it herself with thread purchased from a neighborhood fabric store. Every scratch on its surface carried a memory that no luxury label could replace. Richard saw only an old bag. Danielle saw years of perseverance stitched into every worn seam. Behind the teller stations, one employee quietly glanced toward another. Emily Sanders had worked at the branch for less than 6 months, but she had already noticed the subtle differences in how certain customers were greeted. Some were welcomed before they even reached the counter. Others, like Danielle, were first evaluated by shoes, handbags, and clothing. Emily shifted uneasily, sensing that something about this interaction felt wrong. Across the lobby, an elderly veteran named Harold Mitchell watched while gripping the polished handle of his cane. He had come to deposit a pension check, but now found himself studying Danielle instead. There was no fear in her eyes. No embarrassment. Only remarkable composure, the kind that usually belonged to someone who had already survived much harder days than an uncomfortable conversation inside an air-conditioned bank. Richard mistook that calm for uncertainty. "You understand," he said with another practiced smile, "handling unusually large transactions requires verification." Danielle nodded politely. "Of course. And if there is less than expected inside, we still have standard checking services available." A faint ripple of restrained laughter drifted through one corner of the waiting area. Danielle did not acknowledge it. Instead, she rested her fingertips gently across the weathered leather and looked directly at Richard with quiet confidence that somehow made the room feel smaller. "Verification is important," she said softly. "That is exactly why I came here today." Richard Coleman slowly curled his fingers around the brass zipper, but instead of opening the weathered handbag immediately, he deliberately left his hand resting there as though he were granting Danielle Brooks a favor she had not earned. His polished smile returned, carefully crafted for the small audience that had gathered around the customer service counter. "Before we continue," he said, his voice carrying easily across the bright lobby, "I will need proper identification, account verification, and an explanation of exactly what kind of transaction you believe you are making today." Danielle calmly reached into her cardigan pocket and handed him her driver's license without the slightest sign of irritation. Richard barely glanced at it before laying it beside the keyboard. His attention remained fixed on the faded handbag. In his mind, everything about the woman standing before him fit a familiar pattern he believed he understood. He had spent nearly 20 years climbing through the banking industry, beginning as a teller fresh out of college before earning promotions that eventually placed him in charge of one of Charlotte's highest-performing branches. Along the way he developed habits that quietly shaped every interaction. Wealthy clients were greeted by first name before they reached the desk. Business owners were offered coffee. Investors were escorted into private offices. Customers whose appearance failed to match his expectations were often met with policies, procedures, and unnecessary delays. Richard never considered himself unfair. In fact, he often described himself as practical. "Numbers never lied," he liked to say. But the assumptions he attached to those numbers often did. Across the lobby, sunlight reflected from the polished marble floor, casting pale ribbons of light across the waiting area. Outside, traffic rolled steadily along Tryon Street while pedestrians hurried beneath the warm North Carolina morning sky. Inside the bank, however, time seemed to slow. Emily Sanders quietly watched from behind her station, pretending to organize deposit slips while following every word. Harold Mitchell adjusted his glasses, sensing that the conversation had become about something much larger than a routine withdrawal. Even the security officer near the entrance glanced toward the counter after noticing that several customers had stopped what they were doing. Richard finally looked down at Danielle's identification. "Miss Brooks," he said, emphasizing her last name with professional distance. "Large withdrawals often involve financial planning. Most people contact us ahead of time." Danielle nodded politely. "I understand. And exactly how much do you expect to withdraw?" She answered with the same steady voice she had used since entering the building. "The entire balance." Richard leaned back slightly and released a quiet chuckle. "That is a very confident answer." Danielle simply smiled. "Confidence comes from knowing what belongs to you." Something about that response unsettled him for only a fraction of a second before his certainty returned. He turned his computer monitor slightly away from public view and typed her account information into the banking system, expecting to confirm what he already believed. Perhaps a modest checking account. Maybe a small savings balance accumulated over many years. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would justify the calm certainty standing across from him. While the system loaded, Richard tapped one finger against the granite countertop and looked once again at the old leather handbag. "You know," he said with a faint smirk, "appearances may not be everything, but they usually tell part of the story." Danielle rested her hand gently on the worn leather and answered without raising her voice. "Sometimes they only tell the chapter people choose to read." The login screen disappeared as the account information finished loading. Richard's eyes shifted toward the monitor, still wearing the same confident smile, completely unaware that the next few seconds were about to challenge every assumption he had made since Danielle first walked through the bank's front doors. Richard Coleman's confident smile remained fixed as the account summary finally appeared on his monitor. He glanced at the first line without paying much attention, already convinced that whatever number waited there would justify every assumption he had made. Instead of studying the screen, he looked back toward Danielle Brooks and slowly pulled the weathered handbag closer across the polished granite counter. "Before we go any further," he said, his voice carrying through the quiet lobby, "we should make sure everything you brought complies with our verification procedures." Danielle did not move. She simply nodded once. "Go ahead." The calmness in her answer almost disappointed him. Richard had expected nervousness, excuses, or perhaps embarrassment. Instead, she stood with quiet dignity, hands resting loosely in front of her, her expression unchanged beneath the warm sunlight pouring through the towering windows. Around them, conversations had completely faded. The young couple waiting for their mortgage consultation looked up from their paperwork. Harold Mitchell shifted his weight slightly against his cane, his eyes never leaving the counter. Emily Sanders stopped pretending to organize deposit slips altogether. Even too financial. Advisors walking toward the conference room slowed their pace, sensing that something unusual was unfolding in the middle of the lobby. Richard deliberately grasped the old brass zipper and pulled it open with exaggerated confidence. The soft metallic sound echoed far louder than it should have inside the suddenly silent branch. He looked inside first, expecting loose bills, worn envelopes, or perhaps nothing important at all. Instead, his eyebrows narrowed almost immediately. There were no random papers. Everything inside had been arranged with remarkable care. A thick bundle of neatly organized banking documents rested beside a small velvet presentation box. Beneath them sat a sealed cream-colored envelope bearing the embossed letterhead of a respected Charlotte law firm. Tucked carefully beside it was a polished stainless steel safe deposit key attached to an engraved brass tag with a matching identification number. Richard blinked once. Then again. None of those items belonged inside the story he had already written about Danielle Brooks. Without realizing it, he lifted the envelope into the light. The heavy paper felt expensive. The embossed legal seal reflected beneath the ceiling lights. His smile faded just slightly before he forced it back into place. Interesting, he muttered, attempting to sound unimpressed. Legal paperwork. Danielle answered quietly. Please continue. Richard hesitated for the first time since she had entered the building. The hesitation lasted only a heartbeat, but Emily noticed it immediately. So did Harold. The confidence that had filled Richard's posture only moments earlier now seemed just a little less certain. He carefully placed the envelope on the counter beside the velvet box and picked up the engraved key instead. The brass tag displayed a private vault identification number unlike the standard safe deposit keys issued at his branch. His eyes narrowed once more. Where did you obtain this? Danielle met his gaze without the slightest trace of satisfaction. It belongs to my family. Richard set the key down almost too quickly. He looked back toward his computer screen, intending to dismiss everything as coincidence. Surely the account information would explain it. Surely there was a misunderstanding. As his eyes focused on the numbers displayed beside Danielle's customer profile, the color slowly drained from his face. His breathing paused. His hand remained suspended above the keyboard. The lobby stayed perfectly silent as the reflection of the monitor flickered across his glasses. For the first time in his career, Richard Coleman questioned whether the person standing quietly across from him had been the one judging him all along. Richard Coleman stared at the glowing monitor as though it had suddenly begun speaking a language he no longer understood. He blinked once, refreshed the account page, and then entered Danielle Brooks's customer number a second time with slow, deliberate keystrokes. The same information appeared again. The account was active. The identity had already been verified years earlier through enhanced security procedures. More astonishing than anything else was the balance displayed beside her name, a figure so substantial that it automatically placed the account under the bank's highest level of private wealth management. Richard swallowed quietly, convinced that a technical error had slipped into the system. He clicked through the transaction history, expecting to uncover a mistake. Instead, he found years of meticulously documented financial activity. Regular investments. Trust distributions. Charitable donations. Property tax payments. Scholarship funding. Medical foundation contributions. Every transaction reflected discipline rather than extravagance. Danielle had never flaunted wealth because she had quietly used it to improve lives instead. The confidence Richard had displayed only moments earlier began to dissolve beneath the cold light of his computer screen. Emily Sanders noticed his expression change before anyone else did. She had watched him handle multi-million-dollar business accounts without showing the slightest emotion, yet now his fingers hovered uncertainly above the keyboard. Harold Mitchell adjusted his glasses again, sensing that whatever Richard had discovered was forcing him to reconsider everything he had believed about the woman standing calmly across from him. Danielle remained exactly as she had been since entering the branch. Her posture never changed. Her breathing stayed slow and steady. She did not smile with satisfaction or reveal any hint of triumph. She simply waited with remarkable patience, allowing the truth to reveal itself without a single unnecessary word. Richard finally looked up from the monitor. "Miss Brooks," he said, but the confidence had disappeared from his voice. "There appears to be an unusual situation." Danielle answered softly. "Is the information accurate?" Richard hesitated before nodding almost imperceptibly. "Yes." She glanced briefly toward the old handbag still resting open on the counter. "Then there is no unusual situation." The words landed with quiet precision, and for several long seconds nobody spoke. Richard reached for the cream-colored envelope again, this time with noticeably greater care. Breaking the seal, he removed several professionally prepared documents printed on thick ivory paper. The first page identified Danielle as the legal beneficiary and acting representative of the Brooks Family Legacy Trust, a financial estate established nearly 2 decades earlier by a distant relative whose investments had grown far beyond anyone's original expectations. Attached behind it was another document bearing the signatures of attorneys, accountants, and bank officers from previous years. Richard continued turning pages until one particular letter caught his attention. It had been addressed directly to executive management at Franklin National Bank and documented an unresolved administrative discrepancy involving assets connected to the trust. The issue had remained dormant for years because Danielle had requested additional documentation before taking any legal action. Richard felt his heartbeat quicken. This was no ordinary customer. This was someone whose visit carried consequences extending far beyond a simple withdrawal. Slowly, almost unwillingly, he looked toward the security cameras mounted discreetly across the lobby. Every conversation, every dismissive remark, every public assumption had been recorded. Around him, the silence became heavier than before. Customers who had quietly watched the exchange now studied Richard instead of Danielle. For the first time since the morning began, the center of attention had shifted completely. Richard closed the folder with careful hands, fully aware that the greatest mistake he had made that day was not underestimating the value of the account. It was underestimating the dignity of the woman who owned it. The entire branch seemed to exhale at once, yet no one spoke. The bright morning light pouring through the towering windows had not changed, but somehow it felt softer now, stretching across the polished marble floor until it reached the old leather handbag that still rested quietly on the granite counter. Danielle Brooks gently closed the brass zipper, her movements slow and unhurried, as though she had practiced patience for so many years that it had become part of her heartbeat. She looked neither victorious nor offended. She simply looked tired, the kind of quiet exhaustion that came from carrying dignity through rooms where people insisted on mistaking kindness for weakness. Richard Coleman remained frozen behind his desk, the legal documents still resting beneath his trembling fingertips. The numbers on his monitor had not changed. Neither had the trust records or the verified account information. What had changed was the story he had written in his own mind before Danielle had spoken a single sentence. For years he had believed experience gave him the ability to recognize successful people the moment they walked through the front door. Now every confident assumption seemed painfully fragile beneath the undeniable truth glowing from the computer screen. Emily Sanders slowly stepped away from her workstation, carrying a glass of water without being asked. She placed it gently beside Danielle. "Would you like some water, ma'am?" she asked quietly. Danielle offered the young teller a grateful smile. "Thank you. That is very thoughtful." It was the first genuine act of warmth anyone had offered her since she entered the building. Emily smiled back, feeling unexpectedly relieved, as though a heavy weight inside the lobby had finally begun to lift. Across the waiting area, Harold Mitchell lowered his newspaper onto his lap. He had witnessed enough years to recognize moments that changed people forever. This was not about money anymore. It had become something much deeper. Several customers who had quietly watched from a distance now looked away with expressions that mixed discomfort and reflection. Some remembered the jokes they had almost laughed at. Others recalled how quickly they had accepted Richard's judgment simply because he wore an expensive suit behind an important desk. Danielle reached into her handbag once more, not for another document but for a neatly folded photograph. She unfolded it carefully before looking at it for a moment. The faded picture showed her parents standing in front of their modest brick home many years earlier, smiling with quiet pride beneath the afternoon sun. Her father had always repeated the same lesson whenever life became difficult. Character is the one thing nobody can take from you unless you hand it away yourself. Danielle softly traced the edge of the photograph with her thumb before placing it back inside the bag. She had carried those words far longer than she had carried wealth. Richard noticed the photograph disappear into the handbag and suddenly understood that everything valuable inside had been earned through generations of sacrifice, discipline, and faith rather than privilege or appearances. The realization settled heavily over him. Outside, a gentle breeze stirred the American flag standing beside the entrance, its reflection rippling faintly across the glass doors. Inside, the ticking of the large wall clock became strangely clear, each passing second reminding everyone in the room that moments of judgment lasted only seconds, while the consequences of those judgments could remain for years. Richard slowly removed his name badge and placed it on the counter beside the unopened velvet box. He lowered his eyes, no longer looking at Danielle as another customer standing in line, but as a woman whose quiet grace had exposed a truth no balance sheet could ever measure. In the stillness that followed, no voice needed to explain what every heart in the room had finally begun to understand. Richard Coleman drew a slow breath before pressing a button beneath his computer monitor that connected directly to the executive offices upstairs. His voice, usually polished and unwavering, carried an unfamiliar restraint. "Could I please request that Regional Director Susan Whitaker come to the main lobby? I have a matter that requires immediate review." The employee on the other end paused, surprised by the seriousness in his tone, then quietly agreed. Richard lowered the receiver and folded his hands together, no longer attempting to project authority. Danielle Brooks remained standing exactly where she had been since entering the bank, her weathered handbag resting gently against the counter, her expression calm despite the attention surrounding her. Less than 2 minutes later, the elevator doors opened and Susan Whitaker stepped into the lobby with measured confidence. She had managed banking operations across 3 states for nearly 15 years and possessed the rare ability to notice details others overlooked. Before speaking, she observed the room itself. Customers were unusually quiet. Employees stood motionless behind their stations. Richard's name badge rested on the granite counter instead of his jacket. The atmosphere alone told her something significant had happened. "Richard," she said evenly, "what seems to be the issue?" Richard swallowed before answering. "There is no issue with the account. The issue is with how I handled the customer." Susan turned toward Danielle and offered a warm, professional smile. "Good morning, ma'am. I am Susan Whitaker. I apologize if your visit has been anything less than respectful." Danielle nodded politely. "Thank you for coming." Susan reviewed the documents Richard handed her. She examined the trust records, the legal correspondence, the safe deposit documentation, and finally the account profile displayed on the monitor. Her expression remained composed, but she understood immediately why Richard had called. She also understood something else after reading the attached correspondence. Several years earlier, Danielle had quietly instructed her attorneys not to pursue formal complaints regarding previous administrative delays because she believed people deserved opportunities to correct honest mistakes before facing serious consequences. Susan looked up from the papers with genuine curiosity. "Miss Brooks, may I ask why you chose not to escalate these concerns when they first occurred?" Danielle answered without hesitation. "Because systems improve when people learn. Punishment alone rarely teaches respect." The word settled over the room with unexpected weight. Emily Sanders felt a lump rise in her throat. Harold Mitchell slowly removed his cap, holding it respectfully against his chest. Susan closed the folder and looked directly at Richard. "Is there anything about her account that justified the assumptions made this morning?" Richard lowered his eyes. "No." "Did any bank policy require the public comments that were made?" His voice grew even quieter. "No." Susan nodded once. There was disappointment in her expression, but no anger. "Then this moment is not about banking procedures. It is about professional judgment." Richard finally lifted his eyes toward Danielle. For the first time that morning, he truly saw her. Not as a woman carrying an old handbag. Not as someone whose appearance fit a stereotype he had invented. He saw a daughter who had honored her parents, a woman who had quietly supported her community, and a customer who had demonstrated more grace in a single morning than he had shown in years of leadership. The realization reached deeper than embarrassment. It challenged the foundation of how he had measured people throughout his career. Standing beneath the soft morning light, Richard understood that the greatest wealth revealed inside the bank that day had never been displayed on his computer screen. It had been standing patiently across from him all along, waiting for someone to recognize a value that could never be measured in dollars. Richard Coleman stepped away from the counter and walked around it slowly until he stood only a few feet from Danielle Brooks. Every polished shoe that had once reflected confidence now seemed unusually heavy against the marble floor. The entire lobby remained silent, not because anyone had been asked to stop speaking, but because every person present sensed they were witnessing something that reached far beyond a banking transaction. Richard folded his hands in front of him, searching for words that did not sound rehearsed. After several quiet seconds, he spoke. "Miss Brooks, I owe you an apology. Not because of the balance in your account. Not because of the documents inside your bag. I owe you an apology because I decided who you were before I ever gave you the chance to introduce yourself." His voice was steady, but his expression carried genuine regret. Danielle looked at him with the same calm eyes that had never once reflected anger throughout the morning. Richard continued. "Everything I said today reflected assumptions that had no place in this bank, and certainly no place in my position. I embarrassed you in front of people who trusted me to treat every customer with fairness. I cannot undo those moments, but I accept full responsibility for them." Susan Whittaker quietly nodded beside him, allowing the apology to belong entirely to Richard. Emily Sanders lowered her eyes, deeply moved by the honesty she was hearing. Harold Mitchell smiled gently beneath his gray mustache, recognizing that admitting fault required a different kind of courage than defending pride. Danielle remained silent for another moment before finally answering. "Mr. Coleman, everyone makes mistakes." Richard looked up, surprised by the gentleness in her voice. She continued, "The difference is what people choose to learn after they make them." Richard listened carefully, saying nothing. Danielle rested one hand on her weathered handbag before speaking again. "When I was a little girl, my father used to tell me that respect is the only gift that costs nothing and means everything. He believed every person deserved it before they earned anything else." Her words settled quietly across the lobby. No one interrupted. No one looked away. "I did not come here hoping to prove that I had money," she continued. "Money changes over time. People gain it. People lose it. That is life. I came here expecting to be treated like every other customer who walks through these doors." Richard slowly nodded. "You should have been." Danielle smiled softly. "Then let today become the day someone else never has this experience." Susan stepped forward with quiet professionalism. "Miss Brooks, on behalf of Franklin National Bank, I sincerely apologize for the way you were treated today. We will be conducting a full review of our customer service practices and employee training because respect cannot depend on appearances. It must be our standard every single day." Danielle appreciated the sincerity behind the statement. "That matters more to me than any formal letter." Susan extended her hand, and Danielle accepted it warmly. Richard then reached toward the granite counter and carefully picked up his name badge. For a brief moment he looked at the engraved letters before fastening it back onto his jacket. This time it no longer felt like a symbol of authority. It felt like a reminder of responsibility. Around the lobby, customers gradually returned to their conversations, but something had quietly changed. The young couple waiting for their mortgage meeting smiled politely at Danielle as she passed. Emily opened the door for an elderly customer before he even asked. Harold tipped his cap respectfully toward Danielle, and she returned the gesture with a grateful smile. Without raising her voice or demanding revenge, Danielle had transformed the atmosphere of the entire branch simply by choosing grace where bitterness would have been easier, leaving behind a lesson that every person in the room would remember long after the paperwork had been filed away. Danielle Brooks gathered the carefully organized documents, placed the cream-colored envelope back inside her weathered leather handbag, and closed the brass zipper with the same gentle motion that had begun her morning. Nothing about her expression suggested triumph. There was no satisfaction in proving anyone wrong, only the quiet peace that comes from refusing to let another person's judgment define your own character. Susan Whittaker personally completed the withdrawal paperwork in a private office, ensuring every remaining detail was handled with the professionalism Danielle should have experienced from the moment she walked through the front doors. When the transaction was finished, Susan accompanied her back into the lobby instead of sending another employee. Richard Coleman stood waiting near the entrance, his posture no longer reflecting authority alone but humility earned through difficult self-reflection. As Danielle approached, Richard opened the glass door for her before saying one final thing. "Miss Brooks, thank you for giving me the opportunity to become a better man than the one who greeted you this morning." Danielle paused beneath the sunlight pouring through the doorway. She looked toward him with a warm smile that carried neither resentment nor superiority. "Opportunities matter," she said softly. "What we choose to do with them matters even more." Richard nodded slowly, understanding that forgiveness did not erase mistakes, but it could transform the person willing to learn from them. Danielle stepped onto the sidewalk as the warm North Carolina breeze brushed gently across her face. Cars moved steadily along the street, people hurried toward offices and coffee shops, and the city continued exactly as it had before she entered the bank. Yet something inside the building behind her had quietly changed forever. Over the following weeks, Franklin National Bank introduced new customer service training centered on dignity, fairness, and unconscious bias. Employees participated in discussions that encouraged them to recognize how quickly assumptions could shape decisions. Emily Sanders became one of the strongest voices during those sessions, often remembering the calm woman with the weathered handbag who had demonstrated more leadership as a customer than many people displayed in management positions. Harold Mitchell told his grandchildren about the morning he watched respect overcome prejudice without anger or revenge. Susan Whitaker often reminded new supervisors that policies protected transactions, but character protected trust. Richard Coleman carried the memory with him every day he walked through the bank's front entrance. Whenever someone arrived wearing work boots covered with dust, a faded jacket, or carrying bags that appeared old and worn, he greeted them exactly the same way he greeted the wealthiest clients. Not because he feared another mistake, but because he had finally understood that every person deserved to be seen before being judged. Months later, Danielle returned to the branch for another routine appointment. This time the receptionist welcomed her before she reached the counter. Emily smiled and asked how her mother was doing. Richard stepped forward, shook her hand with sincere respect, and thanked her for coming back. Danielle noticed none of these gestures felt forced anymore. They had become part of the culture rather than exceptions to it. As she finished her business and prepared to leave once again, sunlight reflected across the polished marble floor, illuminating the same old leather handbag resting quietly at her side. It still carried the faded scratches earned through years of faithful use. It still looked ordinary to anyone passing by. But now everyone inside the bank understood that true value had never depended on what the bag looked like from the outside. Danielle walked through the glass doors and disappeared into the rhythm of the city, her footsteps steady, her heart at peace, while behind her the lobby settled into a gentle silence where kindness had become stronger than pride, respect had become stronger than assumption, and the quiet dignity of one ordinary woman continued to echo long after she was gone.